Hello, everyone. My name is Fei Wang. I'm currently an associate professor of health informatics in Department of Population Health Sciences at Weill Cornell Medicine in Cornell University. And my research interests have been developing a novel AI or machine learning technologies for analyzing healthcare data and help with healthcare problems. And the title of my tutorial is AI for COVID-19, battling the pandemic with the computational intelligence, which I will introduce some of the research on how people use AI to analyze different kinds of COVID-related data and provide insights to like patients or clinicians or basic scientists or policymakers. So everybody knows like from December 2019 until now, we suffer from a global pandemic caused by a virus or SARS-CoV-2, which looks like this figure. And so far the virus has, the disease this virus caused is called COVID-19. And so far this virus has caused a lot of confirmed cases, tens of millions of confirmed cases, millions of confirmed deaths over hundreds of countries and territories. This is a graphic showing the distribution of the cases all over the world so far. We can, from the figure, we can see for countries like US, like some countries in South America, in Europe, and also Africa and Asia. According to the darkness of the color, you can see, they all have a large number of confirmed cases. You can see the darkest color indicate that region has more than 1 million confirmed cases. And this is the distribution of the confirmed deaths all over the world. So we can see certain countries like US, like Brazil, like Russia, like India, they have the darkest color, which indicates that they have a high number of confirmed deaths caused by this disease. So this is really a global pandemic, caused a lot of impacts and suffer for people everywhere. And this is a curve showing over the time. So what is the trend of the increasing number of confirmed cases for two different countries. The top one is a curve according to United Kingdom, from which, both figures are in the log scale. From the top figure, we can clearly see a two-wave trend for the case increasing in the United Kingdom. And from the bottom figure, we can see that for US, it is almost a kind of like always increasing trend in terms of the number of cases, although there are some fluctuations in the middle of 2020, but overall, it has a pretty impressive increasing trend. So then this brings a lot of, clearly it brings a lot of damage globally on all aspects for humans' daily living. So researchers and healthcare workers have been thinking of all different ways to battle with this disease, recognize this disease, and see if there is any effective interventions or treatment that can reduce the impact of this disease and finally stop the propagation or pandemic. During, you can imagine during this process, a large amount of COVID-related data have been accumulated, which provided a unprecedented opportunity for us, like AI or machine learning researchers or computer scientists, to develop appropriate algorithms that can derive insights from all those different kinds of accumulated data, which is clearly large-scale, high-dimensional, time-varying, and heterogeneous. So how can we derive insights using the right algorithm from the right data? In this tutorial, I'm going to summarize some of the representative efforts along this line, and I will particularly organize my tutorial into 4 key parts. So number 1 is epidemiology. So it is very important to predict the trend on how this epidemic gonna progress, like the increasing trend of the number of cases and deaths, and how the virus is likely to propagate locally and globally, and what kind of non-pharmaceutical intervention policies could be effective maximally prevent the spread of the disease. So people have been using or developing all different kinds of data-driven or mechanistic-driven epidemiology or machine learning-based predictive models based on all different kinds of data from online, public data, or private data from documented governments, social media, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to introduce some of the works on this aspect. The second one is therapeutics. So basic scientists like biologists and chemists, so for people who study the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is the virus that caused the COVID-19 disease, they have been looking at like if there is any disease mechanism we can figure out from the microscope level or from the virus level, so that if we can understand how this virus is going to attack a human organ system, then we can understand, we can derive appropriate ways to reduce the impact and maybe even for early intervention or treatment. So there are lots of like public data set have been released in, I mean, mainly involved like the microscope level, like the human, based on the human host and virus interactome or protein-protein interaction network, and even disease network, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to summarize some of the basic basic science efforts on how to leverage advanced AI technologies to help us to identify appropriate, especially therapeutics for this disease. And the third one is, of course, clinical research. So COVID-19 has impacted so many people all over the world. And during the process of treating and management of patients, large amount of clinical data have been accumulated, which encode a lot of insights and experiences, which are precious for us to understanding how to treat the disease, and also understand the disease and how the patient's gonna recover from the disease. So the third part, I'm going to introduce some of the efforts along this line. And the fourth one is social and behavioral research. I mean, a lot of people have been impacted, especially mentally impacted by the disease, and they tend to express their concerns or want to know more on social media, and also the mobility pattern of the all the people have changed a lot. And so and also the government wants to do like contact tracing to better understand, I mean, how the disease propagates, and to effectively and efficiently identify the sources. So there are lots of AI-related efforts on conducting social and behavioral research in the context of COVID-19. So the fourth part will be about that. And at last, I'm going to talk about what are the challenges we are facing so far, and what are the experience and lessons we have learned for developing AI technologies for battling with COVID-19. So with all that, I'm going to go to the first part, which is about epidemiology. Now let's go to the second part of this tutorial, which is epidemiology. And the goal of these kind of problems is to build predictive models to predict the trend of the epidemic in terms of, for example, the number of newly infected cases, the number of deaths, and so on and so forth. So first, we're going to talk about some conventional epidemiology based compartment model. For those compartment model, they partition the population into different compartments. For example, in the most basic suspected, infected, and removed model, which is referred to SIR model. Initially, we assume we have a entire patient population where everybody could be a suspected one, and if there is a contagious disease such as COVID-19, then we discovered there are several infected cases, and through the interactions, those infected cases gonna infect more suspected people, and you get more infected cases. And at the same time, with ongoing progression of the disease, some of the infected cases will become removed. They can either be cured or dead. So that's how these three compartments are defined. The most basic SIR model looks like this. It describes how these three compartments transits between each other. And one basic assumption is that for the size of the three compartments, if you add up all of them all together, they wouldn't change over time. So here, S is the stock of a suspectable population, and I is the stock of the infected population, and R is the stock of removed population. Here, removed is really a death or recovery, and N is the total population size, which is equal to the size of S plus the size of I plus the size of R. And so here, the three ordinary differential equations characterized how the transition has happened. So the first gray equation basically describes the fact that through the interactions between the suspected and the infected, the number of suspected population, the size of the suspected population is becoming less and less. And the equation in the red box describes that the number of infected people is becoming more and more by transitioning more suspected people into infected people, while at the same time, certain infected people will become removed by either they're died or they're cured, and the function in the green box basically describes the removal dynamic. And as we said, for the simple SIR model, they assume at any time the size of the three compartments, if we add up all of them together, it is equal to N. So the derivative is equal to 0. And the one important quantity here, R0 equals the ratio of beta and gamma, is the so-called the basic reproduction number, also called the basic reproduction ratio. And the role of R0 is very important in epidemiology, and if we bring the expression of R0 back to the ordinary differential equation with respect to IT, we can rewrite IT in this format, from which we can see in order to keep IT increasing, we need to have this term in the parenthesis bigger than 0, which is equivalent to, we need to make R0 times S larger than N. So in other words, if we want the epidemic to stop, we need to make this condition happen. So that means that there will be an epidemic outbreak with an increasing number of infection status if you have R0, which is a reproduction number, times ST larger than N. And this is actually a simulation with these three different equations. So you can see over time, the number of suspected drops, number of removed increases, and number of infected first increase and then decrease. And this is another illustration on with basic reproduction number equal to 2. So how the epidemic is going to evolve. And this table on the right shows some of the basic reproduction number for our different diseases. And another popular epidemiology or compartment model is called the SEIR model, where another compartment, which is called expose, is introduced here to account for the fact that for a lot of the infectious diseases like COVID-19, they have a certain incubation period. So the suspectable population will not directly go to the infectious population, but when the people got exposed to the virus, there might be an incubation period before they can become infectious. So by adding in this exposed component, can better characterize this incubation period. The researchers from UCLA, they further extend this SEIR model to account for the unreported cases where basically this model wants to account for the compartment exposed in the model is considered as an individual that has already been infected but have not been tested, because after you test it, you're gonna get the knowledge on if you're infectious or not. So therefore, they also have the capability of infected suspectable individuals. Moreover, some of such individuals can receive a test and be further passed to the infectious compartments, as well as reported to the public, while the other will recover but not appear in public reported cases. Therefore, the authors introduce a new parameter mu, which is between 0 and 1, in the evolution dynamics of IT, which is the infected population. It is introduced to characterize the ratio of exposed cases that are confirmed and reported to the public, which is, the author called it the discovery rate. And the discovery rate reflects the unreported and undiscovered cases, which is an important latent factor in the dynamics, especially in the COVID-19, describing the COVID-19 dynamics. So beta denotes the contact rate between the suspectable and infected groups, including both exposed and infectious compartments in the figure. And sigma denotes the ratio of cases in the exposed compartments that are either confirmed as infectious or recovered, which is removed without confirmation. So mu is the discovery rate of the infected cases, and gamma denotes the transition rate between the compartments I and R. And the authors proposed a machine learning pipeline to estimate model parameters as well as the number of cases as well as removed cases. So given the model parameters, theta, which in this case would be beta, sigma, mu, and gamma, and the initial quantities, I mean the initializations like S0, E0, I0, and R0, the number of individuals in this group, in each group can be calculated at time t via standard numerical ordinary differential equation solvers. And I'm sorry, here this F should be R. And so the IT and RT denotes number of reported numbers of infected cases and removed cases at time t, and the P is some smoothing parameter used to ensure the numerical stability. And given all the initializations, IT and RT can be described as differentiable functions of all the parameters, and the model parameters can be optimized by minimizing the following loss function using some standard gradient based optimizers such as BFGS. And there are also some other researchers further extend this SIR or SEIR model by taking into consideration of hospitalization, critical condition, and death. So here, R0 is actually a dynamically changing reproduction number. And the symbol T Inc. Denotes the average incubation period of COVID-19, and H in the equation that models HCRD, the term T represents T hosp represents the average time that a patient is in a hospital before either recovering or becoming critical. And the T crit denotes the average time that a patient is in a critical state before either recovering or dying. In addition, RA refers to the asymptomatic rate in the infected population, I, and RC refers to the critical rate in hospitalized population, H, and RF refers to the deceased rate in the critical population, C. This model is more robust than SIR. Of course, we can add another E between susceptible and infectious to describe the incubation period for COVID-19. As the introduction of more reliable observations of HCD can provide extra stabilization to the dynamic system. And the authors in that paper further proposed to adjust the controlling parameter R0 to take into consideration of a specific quarantine effects. In reality, it is reasonable to consider such quarantine factors for adjusting the free parameters in the model. The authors utilize the multi-layer perceptron architecture to estimate the hidden variable Q, which stands for quarantine, and augment the epidemiological estimation process. And the augmented model introduces a quarantine length, a strength term Q, and a quarantine population T. QT is designed as an n-layer, multi-layer perceptron with the weight vector W and the input vector XT, which is a concatenation of all the size of the compartments, including ST, SI, R, HCDT. The original reproduction number R0 at each timestamp T is a constant value. The author aims to adjust the value of R0 by adding the variant quarantine stress term QT so that the curve could be more flexible to fluctuate policy changes. The first and second hidden layer of this multi-layer perceptron have 10 and 20 neurons with ReLU activation function. And the deep learning adjusted SARCD model shown here is trained by minimizing the weighted mean square error loss function as we showed in the SUEIR model with the Adam optimizer over 1,000 iterations. And the loss function calculates the weighted average mean square error. And the author further proposed another interesting strategy, which is to stratify the area into different homogeneous regions, and the geographical area the author studied is the Harris County in Houston, and they consider that people get infected either through family transmission or through social activities. In the transmission from strict stay at home to reopening, the population is subject to changes in their social activities, which impacted their probability of infection as well as their risk of transmission to their family members. So therefore, they propose to divide the total population in Harris County into two groups. Low contact group, which includes people in industries that were still closed, and a high contact group includes the people in industries that were reopened due to the economic restart. So intuitively, the subpopulation of people who work from home is those continue to stay at home and have limited chance of contacting the working subpopulation. And the two groups share the same fitted model parameters, but they estimate different R. And the initial R0 for the low contact group is slightly lower than the R0 value of the high contact group. So these are essentially some of the epidemiology models popular epidemiology models that have been leveraged in the prediction of the COVID pandemic. And clearly some machine learning components have been injected to make the model more flexible and accurate. On the other hand, there are also research that are trying to purely develop machine learning based models to achieve the same goal. And this is a work called Deep COVID. And the figure on the right shows the schema of the Deep COVID framework for real-time. It is for real-time COVID-19 forecasting, which includes several modules. The data module is dedicated to data preprocessing, such as imputation of missing values, aggregating at the right temporal and spatial resolution. And this prediction module generates probabilistic forecasts based on the curated data. Finally, the explainability module allows both the real-time and retrospective analysis of forecasts to build intuitive explanations. And the pseudocode on the right actually shows the the predictive modeling module. It uses a feed-forward neural network with autoregressive input to incorporate short-term dependencies in the time series to capture the epistemic uncertainty coming from the data. The author proposed to use a bootstrapping strategy for each future incidence target K. The procedure generates one prediction per bootstrap sample so that it can obtain a set of M predictions representing uncertainty in data. Such uncertainty was also propagated to future predictions to enforce temporal consistency and capture temporal correlations between consecutive forecasts. And in addition to the prediction of number of cases or the number of deaths, there have also been research trying to understand the impact of the non-pharmaceutical interventions or MPIs. So the MPIs such as the gathering ban, travel ban, school closure, business closure, and the stay at home are among the most effective ways of controlling the spreading of COVID-19. In US, different states government have adopted various combinations of MPIs from February to April 2020. And this is a work we have done to build a statistical models to understand the impact of different MPIs. And the figure on the left shows the time varying RT value, the reproduction number, and the inferred infection epidemic curve for two selected states, which is Maryland and Massachusetts, according to the range of RT value on April 19. The blue bars represent the daily number of infections, and orange lines shows the trends of RT, and the gray shading refers to the 95% confidence interval of RT, and the dates range from February 22nd to April 19. And the figure on the right shows the daily number of reported cases and inferred infection cases in the US with the timeline of federal responses about MPIs. The timeline of the MPIs of the 50 states in the US, which is the horizontal axis, and the intervention started on the same day, are represented in one rectangle. So those different rectangles at different dates, indicating the different types of MPIs that were taking action in their respective states. And the authors in the paper leveraged the method in this paper to estimate the time varying reproduction number, which is a two-step procedure to estimate the time-dependent reproduction number from the data informing the serial interval, and from data on the incidence of cases over time. The first step uses data of unknown pairs, which is a serial interval of index and secondary cases to estimate the serial interval distribution. The second step estimates the time-varying reproduction number jointly from incidence data and from the posterior distribution of the serial interval obtained from the first step. And this is estimated effect of lifting specific interventions. In the paper, we use the generalized linear model with ridge regression for gamma distribution to estimate the impact of different interventions on RT, which is a time varying reproduction number. For each state, the population density, per capita GDP, median age, testing rate, and testing positive rate are considered as potential confounders. And for figure A, it shows the risk ratio and 95% confidence intervals of each variable on RT from the generalized linear model. And B shows the distribution of the latest RT, which is estimated for April 21st, which is the ending date of the inferred infection epidemic curve based on reported cases by May 7th, and the RT after lifting different interventions. So based on the figure, we can see that stay at home exhibited the lowest relative risk of value of 0.49, indicating that execution of this MPI could reduce the current IT by about 51%. So stay at home is the most effective one. The reduction in RT generated by gathering ban, non-essential business closure, and the declaration of emergency were 19%, 16%, and 13%, respectively. Interstate travel restrictions, school closure, and the initial business closure achieved a reduction in RT corresponding to 11%, 10%, and 10% respectively. Gathering ban with a larger group of people, like 50 people, has a minimum effect, which reduces the RT to like a 6% with 95% confidence interval, 2 to 11%. Among the 8 interventions. Another type of study people consider is whether we can use existing knowledge from other area to help with the understanding the pandemic of my current with the current study area. So this is a paper studied, proposed a method, interesting method called the synthetic control method, where the goal in this paper is to estimate the effect of different MPIs in a big Chinese city called Shenzhen. So in this paper, the authors try to leverage the data from 68 counties in US without implementing the mild interventions as a quote-unquote synthetic controls to estimate the treatment effect. And the authors use cumulative numbers of confirmed cases of COVID per 100,000 persons in the population that could be observed at time t, whether the intervention were implemented or not. Here T is the time and WT is a group indicator. So WT equals 1 means the MPI is implemented, and WT equals 0 means not. So the potential outcome or the treatment effect can be estimated as C1 minus C0. And because you can only observe what happened if you implement the intervention, or what happened if you cannot observe both. So they match 68 counties in the US according to some PCA components on the confirmed COVID-19 cases per 100,000 from untreated units, which is in the US counties, plus latitude and population density. And they basically do a weighted sum of all the effects in these 68 counties to come up with, these are convex, which means that they are non-negative and add up all together to be 1. So they use some data simulation method to estimate those Ds, and so that they can estimate the counterfactuals according to those synthetic controls to estimate the treatment effect, which is an interesting method. And in another work, we try to study if transfer learning can be useful in this scenario as well. And in this figure, it shows the timeline of COVID-19 dispersion in different countries and government responses. And the start point of the horizontal axis is the date when China reported a cluster of COVID-19 cases in Wuhan, Hubei province, which is December 31st in 2019. And the length of the green bar denotes the days from that date to the date of the first detected cases in each specific country. Every row is a country. And the length of the 8 pink bar, the length of the light pink bar denotes the days from the first detected cases reaching 1 case per million in each country. And the dark pink bar denotes the days from the date reaching 1 case per million to May 31st. And the coordinates in the horizontal axis of the black dot means the days from the starting point to the starting date of the lockdown measure, and the coordinate of the black triangle. So there's first a dot and then a triangle. Um, means the days from the starting date to the end of the date of the lockdown measure. So among the countries which were still under lockdown before May 21, Indonesia, Singapore, and USA had announced their lockdown end date as July 31st, June 1st, and June 1st, respectively. And this is, I mean, we developed a model, a transfer learning architecture called Alert COVID. And the model basically treat a source model on the source countries and transfer the model parameters to the testing countries by fine-tuning the final prediction layer. And the source countries are defined as the ones suffered from the epidemic from more than 84 days and have lifted lockdown for more than 14 days. And there are 12 trends of 11 countries that are identified, and there are 72 countries set as target countries or testing countries. And this is a prediction of cumulative CCPM, and CCPM stands for case per million, 1 case per million on May 31st for the Netherlands that had announced the final date of the lockdown measure. And the red points were the true cumulative CCPM on each day. And the dashed vertical line represented the end date of the lockdown, and the cumulative CCPM values are and the lockdown information during May 18 to May 24 were put in were input to the fine-tuned target model and predicted the cumulative CCPM in 7 days. And the green, yellow, orange, blue points denotes the prediction of 4 different models which are derived from ablation setup. And this is the figure on the right is the basic setup of the prediction model, which is essentially a combination of LSTM model derived from the predictive cases in the past 7 days, plus the lockdown measures, and followed by a fully connected prediction layer. And the last work I want to introduce is the impact of environmental factors. Specifically in this work, we studied the impact of temperature and the relative humidity to the reproduction number or the transmission of the pandemic. And in this work, we used the data for COVID-19 daily symptom onset cases for 100 Chinese cities and the COVID-19 daily confirmed cases for 1,005 US counties. And this figure shows the average R values from January 19 to 23rd, 2020 for 100 Chinese cities. This is the R value. So this is the average temperature, and this is the relative humidity distribution. And this is a similar thing, which shows the average R value from March 15 to April 6 on 2020 for the 1,005 US counties. And this is temperature. And this is the average relative humidity from which you can kind of have a sense on the correlations between the potential correlations between the temperature, humidity, and the transmission. So we use 6-day average temperature and relative humidity values up to and including the day when the R value is measured. Our strategy is inspired by the 5-day incubation period estimated by Johns Hopkins. And we found a series of 60 average temperature and relative humidity and the daily R value curves are pretty non-stationary. And we find a declining trend of R values for nearly all Chinese cities and US counties during our study periods, which could be due to the nature of the disease and people raised awareness and increased self-attention measures before the lockdown. In this case, direct time series regression cannot be applied due to the so-called spurious regression problem, which states the fact that the regression may provide misleading statistical evidence of a linear relationship between non-stationary time series variables. So we adopted a mechanism called the Fama-Macbeth methodology with Newey West adjustment, which consists of a series cross-sectional regressions. Shown here, it includes two steps. And has been proven effective in various disciplines, especially in finance and economics. And our model estimated an increase in temperature by 1 degree Celsius is associated with a reduction of R value of COVID-19 by 0.026 in China and by 0.02 in the US. An increase in the relative humidity by 1% is associated with a reduction of R value by 0.0076 in China and by 0.008 in the US. So which suggests indeed the increase of temperature and humidity, relative humidity, can decrease the epidemic a little bit, but it is not enough to reduce the R value to something below 1, so which is the necessary condition for stopping the pandemic. So which means that those NPIs are still critical to stop the pandemic. So that's all the contents I want to introduce in this section. Hope, of course, this cannot be exhaustive, but I hope the audience can have a basic knowledge on the problems and directions people are studying in the epidemiology area, and especially where the machine learning models or AI models can be helpful. And we're gonna next go to the second part, which is therapeutics. So now let's go to the third part of this tutorial. I will talk about people's, especially the basic scientists' effort on developing effective therapeutic for COVID-19 and how AI could be helpful. So this is the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which causes the COVID-19 disease. It is a genome encodes approximately 25 proteins that are needed by the virus to infect a human to replicate, which is shown in the figure. Among these are notorious spike protein, which recognize the human angiotensin converting enzyme 2 in the initial stage of the infection, and 2 proteases, which cleave viral and human proteins, and the RNA polymerase, which synthesize viral RNA, and the RNA cleaving endoribonuclease. Finding drugs that combine to these viral proteins and stop them from working is a important and logical way forward to priority of many research labs. And one of the approaches shown in this figure, which is mimicking the nature of the use of computational structure-based drug discovery. In this process, as this figure showed, computers dock trial compounds into binding sites in 3-dimensional models of the protein target. The binding affinities of the compound can be calculated with the use of physics-based equations that can quantify the interactions between the drug and its target. The top-ranked compounds are then tested experimentally to see if they do indeed bind and have the required downstream effects. such as stopping viral infectivity on cells and in animal models. This also explains the recent success of Google's AlphaFold, which successfully used computer simulation, which combines mechanics, physical models, and data-driven models to accurately predict the 3D folding structure of the protein. So that's why it is very important in a computational, especially structure-based drug discovery process. So unfortunately, the chemical space is a huge space that this figure shows that the chemical compound the chemists can make is even more than the atoms in the solar space. And actually, the currently available compound database is much, much smaller than the possible chemical compound the chemists can make, and just a smaller portion of them are made of, I mean, to the success of final becoming an FDA approved drug. And please pay attention, this figure on the right is on the log scale. So in this science paper, the authors have proposed to use machine learning, develop machine learning type approaches to do reverse engineering based on machine learning. Inverse molecular design using machine learning type approaches to accelerate the drug discovery process. So quantum chemical methods review the properties of a molecular system only after specifying the essential parameters of the constituent atomic nuclei and their three-dimensional structure. Inverse design, as its name suggests, inverts this paradigm by starting with the desired functionality. So they start from the functionality first and searching for an ideal molecular structure. Here, the input is the functionality and the output is the structure. And functionality need not necessarily map to one unique structure, but to distribution of probable structures. Inverse design uses optimization, sampling, and search method to navigate the manifold functionality of the chemical space. And in order to do that, we need to first represent the chemical compound in an appropriate way, and different types of molecular representations can be applied to one molecule. And the molecule showed in this figure is AQDS, which is used in the construction of organic redox flow batteries. Let's look at this paper. Look at this figure clockwise from the top. Number one is a fingerprint vector that quantifies the presence or absence of molecular environments. And number two is the SMILES strings. And SMILE stands for Simplified Molecular Input Line Entry System that use simplified text encodings to describe the structure of chemical species. And third is the potential energy functions that could model the interactions and symmetries. And number four is a graph with atoms and bond weights. And number five is a column matrix. And number six is a bag of bonds and bag of fragments. And number seven is 3D geometry with associated atomic charges. And number eight is the electronic density. And different machine learning approaches have been leveraged in this process of molecule design. And here, I copied this figure from this science paper in VAE. I don't think I need to explain too much about this method. So here the VAE could be either sequence or graph-based method, and it stands for variational autoencoder. And the problem of the sequence representation is it may lose the structural information as graph representation, and graph restrict to you are usually restricted to specific structures such as trees and may result in a large circle structure as shown in prior studies. And GAN stands for a generative adversarial network. there is no chemical validity guarantee for this method, and sometimes it may cause mold collapse, and it tends to generate duplicated molecules, and which in turn makes GAN only able to generate few novel molecules. Reinforcement learning is more of like a greedy process, and sometimes it can generate a super long chains, which doesn't look like drug. And RNN stands for recurrent neural network processing sequence-based structure like the SMILES code, and some people also use RNN plus graph structure for molecule design, and they are hybrid approaches. In my postdoc we have also designed some algorithm called MoFlow, which use normalizing flow models for molecule design. And the pipeline of our model is shown in this figure. A molecular graph M is represented by a feature matrix for atoms and adjacency tensors for bonds. And in the inference process, the graph conditional flow f A conditioned on B for atoms transforms A given B into conditional latent vector Z A given B, and the glow FB for bonds transforms B into latent vector ZB. The latent space follows, we assume it follows a spherical Gaussian distribution. And for the generation process, it is the inverse transformations of previous operations followed by a validation correction procedure, which ensures the chemical validity. And for regression and optimization, the mapping YZ between the latent space and molecular properties are used for molecular graph optimization and property prediction. And this is the result. We use several indices, including validity without correctness, a correction, uniqueness, novelty, and we also developed a novel index, which is a multiplication of novelty, uniqueness, and the validity, and UV, which can serve as a more comprehensive index to represent how good the algorithm can design a molecule, and also the reconstruction rate. From the figure, from the table, we can see that our algorithm can, which is the last row, the MoFlow method, can achieve much better result compared to a lot of the state-of-the-art approaches. In this paper was published on last year's KDD, and you can play with the source code and data set based on the GitHub link I put here. But molecule design is just the first step. After the molecule get designed, there's still a long way to make this molecule a successful drug and put on market. And this is another paper on Nature Biotechnology last year, which has generated a pretty big impact in the field. It designed a pipeline to make not just the molecule design, but also synthesize the molecule, and proved experimentally it is valid. So this is a workflow of the proposed pipeline. So the part A is the general workflow and the timeline for the design of lead candidates using something called Sequential. I will show in the next week. And the part B is some representative examples of generated structures compared to the parent. In this paper, they are focusing on DDR kinase inhibitor, and part C is the generated compounds for the highest inhibition activity against the human DDR1 kinase. And the model they developed for designing molecular structure is called Sequential, stands for Generative Tensorial Reinforcement Learning. It combines reinforcement learning, variational inference, and tensor decomposition in the generative two-step machine learning approach. First, the mapping is learned in a chemical space to project a set of discrete molecular graph to a continuous space of 50 dimensions. the structure of the learned manifold is parameterized in the tensor train format to use partially known properties. The autoencoder-based model compresses the space of the structures onto a distribution that parameterizes the latent space in a high-dimensional lattice with an exponentially large number of multidimensional Gaussian in its nodes. This parameterization ties latent codes and properties and works with missing values without explicit input. In the second step, the latent space is explored with reinforcement learning to discover new compounds. And the authors of that paper also strives to leverage their pipeline into the process of design new compound for treating SARS-CoV-2, which is the COVID-19 disease. And they also leverage, during the design process, they also leverage the virtual reality technique from the Nano company to help with them about the design process. And that's about what we usually call de novo or in silico molecule design and discovery, which takes a lot of the time. And another concept is called drug repurposing, which is really about repurposed existing drugs that are already on market, whose original therapeutic indication is not COVID-19, but may potentially be used for treat COVID-19. Drug repurposing is attractive to the treatment of COVID-19 for this pandemic is because it can save a lot of time and it is much more efficient and effective, of course, if we can successfully discover a repurposing candidate. And this is a paper we published. I, together with my collaborator, Dr. Fei-Xiong Cheng from Cleveland Clinic and Dr. Jian Tang from Montreal Institute of Learning Algorithms. And we envisioned how computational drug repurposing could be important and promising for treating the COVID-19 disease. And in this paper, a group from Northeastern researchers, they proposed a network medicine perspective for looking for candidates that can potentially be repurposed to treating COVID-19 disease. And in this framework, they model the heterogeneous entities that can potentially involved in the drug repurposing pipeline in a network medicine perspective, where they have this virus-human protein interaction, which captures the human proteins to which the viral protein can bind, and the human protein-protein interaction network, which defines the human interactome of about 18,000 proteins linked by 332,000 pairwise physical interactions, and the drug-human protein interactions, which captures the human protein targets of each drug in the drug bank database. And so this is their input, their pipeline. They have worked out multiple different ways to implement the network medicine perspective. They just envision, I'm sorry for the, there's some problem with the resolution of this slide, but they implemented different pipelines using learning approaches to measure the proximity among different entities for the different part of the network, and they built different pipelines, and finally come up with some measures as the proximity of potential compound and the SARS-CoV-2 virus as the generated hypothesis. And this is the top 100 consensus predictions by the drug repurposing pipeline aggregated with the rank aggregation algorithm output from the various pipelines I showed in the last slides. the top 100 drugs contains 9 drugs with positive experimental outcomes, and 3 of which are among the top 10 drugs, which is great. Drugs highlighted in purple corresponds to strong outcomes. In orange corresponds to weak outcomes. In green corresponds to cytotoxic drugs, which while non-highlighted drugs have shown no effect in viral E6 cells. And in addition to those multi-omics data, people have also been investigating because there is a surge on the amount of literatures or biomedical articles that talking about COVID-19. These article contains a lot of precious information about people's knowledge, especially new knowledge about the SARS-CoV-2 virus and also the disease. So it is an unprecedented resource for us to explore if there is any potential repurposing target for the drug for treating COVID-19. And this is a paper published by my colleague Fei-Xiong Cheng's team, collaboration with Amazon, where they have constructed a huge network, including 39 huge knowledge graph, which includes 39 types of relations over 15 million edges, and they use machine learning, especially network embedding approaches to look for the potential repurposing drug candidates. And I don't want to introduce this in too much detail, but if you are interested, you are welcome to attend our another tutorial, which happened in the morning, but you can still look for the video of it where Dr. Cheng has introduced in very detail about the process of this work. And in addition to this, there are also other researchers who have conducted similar efforts. And this is actually a work called KG. KG stands for Knowledge Graph. It starts by reading existing papers to build what they call a multimedia knowledge graph, where by multimedia, they mean not only just the textual information are extracted, but also the figures and the image captions are also captured, in which the nodes represent entities and concepts, and edge represent relations, events involving these entities, which are, as I said, extracted from both text and images. Given the KG's knowledge graphs enriched and path ranking, with path ranking and evidence mining, COVID-KG can answer natural language questions in an effective way. And these are sort of like the natural language questions, which is given in the paper that their design system could potentially answer, like what is the current indication of the drug, what is the molecular structure, what is the mechanism of action, and so on and so forth. And you can see the example answers and evidence, which is listed as their original literature that mentioning the evidence listed on the right table. And if you're interested, you can go to their original paper and look for more details. And that's all I want to talk about, because there's still no FDA approved treatments for COVID-19, and with the development of these AI approaches, hopefully they can facilitate or accelerate the drug discovery and development process by leveraging all the knowledge from the multi-omics data, literature data, and all the way to the clinical data. Something, excuse me, something I didn't mention for this part is about how to leverage the clinical data or the real-world data to validate the repurposed signal, because a lot of the times people find a lot of promising or positive signals by using the basic science, the data from basic science or biological experiments or multi-omics, but they failed during human clinical trials. It is because the human organ mechanism or architecture is much more complicated than what has been done in on animals or experiments. So leveraging real-world data to help us design better clinical trials and predict the potential side effects can help us improve the success rate of the discovered drug candidates. So in the next part, I'm going to introduce the efforts on the research about SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 based on AI, but on clinical studies. So this is the fourth part of this tutorial where I'm going to introduce how AI can be helpful with the clinical research for COVID-19, and I'm going to focus on two specific scenarios. So one is COVID-19 diagnosis and prognosis. The other is subtyping of COVID-19. And so this is one of the early work published on Cell last year on developing an AI system to analyze the long CT scans to help with the diagnosis and prognosis of COVID-19. So this figure has two parts. So on the top parts, which is portion A, it stands for the workflow of this framework. The author obtained a large CT data set from the China Consortium of Chest CT Image Investigation. It includes 532,000 CT images from COVID-19, common pneumonia, and normal controls. The COVID-19 diagnosis system is composed of two models. So one is the long lesion segmentation model. The other is a diagnosis prediction model. And the authors proposed to first train a segmentation network with 4,700 manually segmented images from COVID-19 and common pneumonia patients, and then feed the result to the diagnosis classifier, which can further produce the probability of the corresponding patient belong to one of the three classes: COVID-19, common pneumonia, and normal controls. And the bottom portion, portion B, shows the AI-assisted clinical prognosis estimation based on the CT quantitative parameters and clinical metadata. This is a system for risk factor evaluation and a Kaplan-Meier curve analysis for severe or critical illness. For the segmentation network, it is actually implemented as a two-stage design. In the first stage, the authors downsampled the input image to a 122 by 122 level and segmented the long field from the image, as the patterns of the long fields were easily learned at a relatively low resolution. In the second stage, they calculated the bounding box with the long field segmentation results. The key region was cropped from the original input image and resized to a 256 by 256 level as the input for the second stage segmentation. And this is actually the 3D classification network, which took input as the result from the segmentation network to predict the three-way classification. And this is the result on the left column. For the images, for the left column are the original CT slices from three COVID-19 patients. The middle column are the manually segmented CT slices, and right column is AI-based automated segmented CT slices. And for row A is a CT slice with mild COVID-19 lesions defined as the small ground glass opacities of bilateral lung involvement. And row B is a CT slice with intermediate COVID-19 lesions, bilateral and predominantly peripheral lesions of the ground glass opacities. And row C is a CT slice with the severe COVID-19 lesions, bilateral and peripheral mixed lesions of ground glass opacities and consolidation shadows. The severity level are defined as in the following way. So mild is defined as less than 3 GGO, which stands for ground glass opacities, lesions of size less than 3 centimeters. Intermediate is defined as a lesion area more than 25% of the entire long field. Severe defined as a lesion area of more than 50% of the entire long field. And on the right side, from figure A to D, are the receiver operator characteristic curve and normalized confusion matrices, multi-class classifications. The blue curve denoted macro average of the AUC of one versus the other two classes. I mean, here the one class is the COVID-19, including I mean, the other two classes, including normal pneumonia and a common pneumonia and normal controls. And from which we can see that the system the author proposed on these data sets can achieve a pretty high accuracy. I mean, for a 3-way classification, they can achieve like an accuracy of over 92% and AUC over 98%. And for the 2-way classification between COVID-19 versus others, it can achieve an accuracy of above 92% and sensitivity close to 95%, specificity above 91%, and overall AUC over 97%, which is pretty impressive. And later on, there is another paper published by a collaboration between Mount Sinai Hospital and some institutions in China, where they try to integrate both the imaging features and the clinical features to perform the COVID diagnosis. And actually, this is a pipeline of their work, of their proposed model, where 3 AI models are used to generate the probability of patient of being COVID-19. So number one, the first one is based on the chest CT scan, similar as what we have seen in the previous example. And the second is on clinical information. And the third one is on the combination of chest CT scan and clinical information. So in order to evaluate the chest CT scans, every slice was first ranked by the probability of containing a parenchymal abnormality as predicted by the CNN model, which is a pre-trained pneumonia tuberculosis model that has over 99% accuracy to select abnormal long slices from the chest CT scans. The top 10 abnormal CT images per patient were put into the second CNN, which is to predict the likelihood of COVID-19 positivity. That's a model P1. And demographic and clinical data, including the patient age and sex, exposure history, symptoms, and lab tests, were put into a machine learning model to classify the COVID positivity. That's a model P2. Features generated by the diagnosis CNN model and the non-imaging clinical information machine learning model were integrated by a multi-layer perceptron to generate the final output of the joint model P3. And this is characteristics of the data used for evaluation in this paper, which includes the chest CT scans from 905 patients for whom there was a clinical concern of COVID-19 that was acquired between January 17, 2020 and March 3, 2020. from 18 medical centers in 13 provinces in China. So this is the prediction performance. So for the ROC curve figure A, it compares the ROC curves produced by the joint model, the CNN model, trained on the basis of just on CT images, the multi-layer perceptron model, trained on the basis of clinical information, and 2 radiologists. And for table B, it is a comparison of success rates of diagnosing patients who are positive for COVID-19 with normal CT scans. And radiologists were provided with both CT imaging and clinical information in making their diagnosis. For table C2E, there are the comparisons of AUC's sensitivities and specificities achieved by the AI models and radiologists. Two-sided p-values were calculated by comparing the joint model to the CNN model, the MLP model, and the 2 human raters in sensitivity, specificity, and AUC. And AUC comparisons were evaluated by the DeLong test. Sensitivity and specificity comparisons were calculated using Clopper-Pearson method to calculate the 95% confidence interval shown in the parentheses, and exact McNamara's test to calculate the p-value. And this figure shows the feature interpretations of the long CT scans. So for each pair of images shown as A, B, C, and D, the left image is the CT image, showing the segmented long used as the input for the CNN model trained only on CT images, and right image shows the heat map of pixels that the CNN model classified as having a SARS-CoV-2 infection. The red indicates higher probability. And number A is a 51-year-old female with fever and history of exposure to SARS-CoV-2. The CNN model identified abnormal features in the right lower lobe, which is indicated as a white color. Whereas the 2 radiologists labeled the CT as negative. For section B is a 52 years old female who had a history of exposure to SARS-CoV-2 and presented with fever and a productive cough. Bilateral and peripheral ground glass opicities, which are indicated by the arrows, were labeled by the radiologist, and the CNN model predict the positivity based on the features in the matching areas. For section C, it corresponds to a 72-year-old female with exposure history to the animal market in Wuhan, presented with fever and productive cough. The segmented CT image shows the ground glass opacity in the anterior aspect of the right lung, indicated by the arrow, whereas the CNN model labeled the CT as negative. For section D, a 59-year-old female with cough and exposure history, the segmented CT image shows no evidence of pneumonia, and the CNN model also labeled the CT as negative. And all those are as we expected, because of the effectiveness of deep learning models on analyzing images. Those are kind of like the studies that shows the advantage of leveraging AI techniques, especially deep learning techniques that can help us with COVID-19 based on medical images. In those cases are mostly long CT scans. However, so the CDC has put interim guidelines for collecting, handling, and testing clinical specimens of COVID-19, where it explicitly stated that for initial diagnostic testing of SARS-CoV-2, CDC recommends collecting and testing an upper respiratory specimen, so which is, mostly what we have seen by those nose swabs or oral swabs. So this basically creates another area where we are thinking of whether we can leverage AI technologies to help us improve diagnostics of COVID-19 by providing better support about this test. So what is this test? So this is called RT-PCR test. So reverse transcription polymerase chain reaction test. So what does it do? So because from previous sections we know our SARS-CoV-2 is in single-strand RNA sequence. So in order to leverage this test to detect if there is a certain amount of virus, in this patient's body. So we have to first replicate this virus and let the viral load exceeds a certain threshold. And because the the SARS-CoV-2 virus is an RNA sequence, and in order to achieve the goal of replication and increase the viral load during the testing. So, we first need to make this RNA sequence a double strand like DNA, then it can be replicated. So this is what this reverse transcription does. And after that, so basically this is how you're gonna put the specimen obtained from either nose or oral swabs into an RT-PCR machine, and then it's gonna do this reverse transcription and then do the replication. And with the several cycles, they're gonna check if the viral load exceeds a certain threshold. Typically, the upper bound of the number of cycles is set to 35. So if with very few number of cycles it exceeds the threshold, then you basically got a positive. If after 35 cycles you still cannot exceed the threshold, then we say this patient is negative. So as you can see, so this process is not just a binary process. It's really, it is a continuous value with respect to the number of cycles. So with a smaller number of cycles, that indicates your initial viral load might be high. So with a higher number of cycles, it indicates your initial viral load might be low. But one problem of this process is, as this New York Times article states, so there could be a high false positive, a false negative rate. So it is estimated there could be more than 30% false negatives, which means that these patients, although the testing is negative, but they could be still infected by the virus and become infectious later on by themselves. And with this article, there are also quite a few papers published on prestigious clinical journals expressing concerns about the potential false negatives of the RT-PCR test. And we are thinking of, based on this observation, so we are thinking of, can we leverage, let's say, the routine blood test results of the patients who around the time when the patient was taking the RT-PCR test, because for patients who got infected by by SARS-CoV-2, they may demonstrate, they may have already demonstrated some abnormalities in their routine blood test results. So this has been mentioned by quite a few epidemiological studies, existing studies from different places. So this comes with our design. So essentially, we are collecting the routine blood test results of the patient within 2 days before the RT-PCR test, and we constructed you can think of as a high dimensional vector, where the values of where each dimension of that vector corresponds to a unique routine blood test, and the value corresponds to a summary statistic, because one routine blood test can be ordered multiple times within the 2-day period. So we can calculate the average, the maximum, the minimum, or the median, and our robustness testing suggests that that won't impact the result too much. And after we do that, we build a vector for every patient, and we know the final result of the RT-PCR test in the training phase. So we can build a machine learning model. In our case, we find a gradient boosting decision tree can achieve the best result to basically build a predictor that can, based on your routine blood test results 2 days prior to the RT-PCR test, I can tell you the likelihood of you are actually having a SARS-CoV-2 infection or no. And there are, there are two goals for this research. So number one is, as we said, we hope a routine blood test can serve as additional markers that can tell us more robustly the actual SARS-CoV-2 infection status of the patient. And number two is a routine blood test is a much better available all over the world, including both, the developed regions and underdeveloped regions, and we can get the results from routine blood tests much more quicker. Much quicker. So we can essentially get the result estimation in a more efficient way, so that for the clinical decision makers, they can have a better sense on later on how to deal with this patient, and is there any resource they need to plan ahead of time. So this is the result from which we can see the gradient boosting tree model can achieve a really good AUC based on the training data collected from our own hospital, which is New York Presbyterian Hospital at Weill Cornell Medicine. And the data used for model development is collected during the peak time, which is March and April in New York, based on the patients who are took the RT-PCR test in our hospital. And we can see the AUC here for GDBT is 85%. And we, after the model is built, we have also interpreted the model based on like the SHAP value, which is a post-hoc model interpretation method for black box models. And as you can see, the feature contributions to the prediction. So here, the horizontal axis corresponds to the SHAP value for every feature you can think of as a contribution to the final prediction. And the vertical, the color is really indicating, the feature values is high or low. And so for every feature in this row, it corresponds to a collection of data points, and each data point corresponds to a specific patient that in our development cohort. And this how can we read this figure is essentially, for example, for white blood count. So what this pattern suggests is actually from the blood, the WBC result, within 2 days prior to the RT-PCR test, actually a lower WBC result contribute to a higher positivity likelihood of COVID-19. And for example, a higher LDH value within 2 days prior to the RT-PCR test, it contributes to a positive SARS-CoV-2 infections later on. And figure B shows for an individual who, the testing result is RT-PCR result is negative, but our model predict it has a 95% probability. 0.95 probability this patient is going to be a positive, and the interpretation lists all the factors that contributes to such a high positivity likelihood prediction. And actually what happens in reality is this patient ordered another RT-PCR test within 3 days and the result turns to positive. So that means that our model can indeed offer the potential of catching the potential false negatives in reality. But one problem is, as we said, our model is trained based on the peak time at New York in our hospital. So we know at that time it is not in the wide testing stage. So for patient who can get the RT-PCR test, they have to be really sick. So they have to have certain symptoms, COVID-related symptoms. But over the time, let's say after May, June. So the testing is becoming really broad for anyone who are suspicious or have light symptoms or even without symptoms. If you want to take a test, you can order that test. So this makes the testing population much bigger and the positive rate drops dramatically after late May. So we basically, our model was trained on March-April period, so it is unlikely this model is going to work, with the evolution of time. And this is actually a figure showing the change of the CT value of the patient in our hospital who got SARS-CoV-2 positive, as you can see over time, there is some changes on the patterns of the CT values, and this is kind of like the UMAP embedding of all the positive patients from March to June. We embed them, of course, using their lab test profiles, and we color them according to their corresponding CT values. And we find actually, as I said, so the lower CT value indicates a higher viral load, which there are some studies suggested that it may cause a more severe clinical outcome later on. So we color them according to the CT value, and the dark color means the higher viral load, which may indicate a more severe clinical outcome. And we can see that there is a cluster of a darker color group, which includes a lot of the we can say high viral load patients, and we use like a density estimation method to basically draw a minimum enclosing ball to identify this region, and we calculated lab test result profile for the patient within this region. We call it a representative profile. There are some theories talking about over time, the viral load is becoming light. As you can see, the CT value is becoming higher and higher. So people say, this suggests, the higher the CT value is lower the viral load. So the viral load is becoming lower and lower, and so which means that the disease is becoming less and less deadly. And there are some theory suggesting this might be because the aging distribution of the patients changes over time. They say, later on, after the peak time, the infected patients are mostly young people, but we don't see such a big trend in our cohort. And this is a kind of like the evolution of the typical lab profile, as I said, over different months. So we can see, so for the positive patients in the typical region are mostly from March and April, and in May and June, of course, the positive rate is dropped so dramatically, and the patterns of actually the positive patient also change. You can see they're scattered at different places instead of mainly residing in that region. And we also investigated the difference between the the positives and negatives who are within that circle or outside that circle, and what are the differences. So this is a violin plot of certain individual lab tests like the lymphocyte count, the monocyte count, basophil, albumin, hemoglobin, and so on and so forth. So we can see, so there is a pretty significant difference for the lab test value within the circle and outside the circle. And this is, I mean, with this prediction tool, so we can see that it can very well complement with the RT-PCR test, and we can imagine by combining it together with the RT-PCR result, it can get us a more reliable and robust estimation of the actual infection status of the patients. And there have been also other prognostic studies proposed by other people for COVID-19, and this is an example, which is actually a risk calculation tool for predicting critically ill COVID-19 patients at based on their records at admission, and this is developed by the Guangzhou Institute of Respiratory Health. And as you can see, there are just 10 different features in the calculation tool, and you can imagine after, this is a web-based tool, after the clinicians see a patient input all the information, it can give you a score indicating the risk of this patient going to become critically ill later on. And this is a paper actually published on JAMA Internal Medicine. And for their study, they first identified a set of 1590 patients collected from 575 hospitals in 31 provincial administrative regions between November 21st, 2019 and January 31st, 2020. And they, based on that cohort, they also, because they want to define critically, if the patient is critically ill or no, so they define the severity of COVID-19, mainly severe or non-severe, based on American Thoracic Society guidelines for a community-acquired pneumonia, given the extensive acceptance of this guideline. And they define critically ill COVID-19 as a composite admission to intensive care unit, invasive ventilation, or death. And this is a composite outcome. And they adopted this composite endpoint or outcome because the admission to ICU, invasive ventilation, and death are all serious events or outcomes of COVID-19 that have been adopted in prior studies to assess the severity of other serious infectious disease as well. And after that, so 72 variables were measured at the hospital admission for those patients, including the demographics, symptoms, comorbidities, radiology findings, and lab tests. And then they apply a lasso model to basically do a dimensionality reduction, after which 19 variables remain significant predictors of a critical illness. And these variables, including clinical features and the blood test result and chest X-ray abnormality, age, exposure to Wuhan, first and highest body temperature, respiratory rate, systolic blood pressure, hemoptysis, dyspnea, skin rash, unconsciousness, number of comorbidities, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, cancer, oxygen saturation levels, neutrophils, neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, LDH, direct bilirubin, and creatinine levels. And after that, they build a logistic regression model to build the predictor of critical illness, and they find that 10 variables that are shown in the previous user interface are independently significantly statistically significant predictors of critical illness and were included in the final risk score calculation. They build the risk calculator on top of these 10 factors. And this is a performance. So based on the internal bootstrap validation, the mean AUC on this data can achieve like 0.88. And they also evaluated the performance of this risk calculator on the independent validation cohort, which is also around 0.88. And so the same set of authors also studied in another setting, in a time to event setting, about risk stratify the critically ill patients based on the survival modeling framework, where the only difference is the final model that is used for risk prediction is not a simple logistic regression, but it is a deep survival model. So as you can see, the 10 features identified by their algorithm, they let it go through a multi-layer perceptron with the final loss being the survival loss, and they train that and get the result, and they got some good AUC values as shown on the right figure. So this is one work based on the study from China. Of course, it collects a large patient data sets, but still it is, we can say, just based on the single country data. And there is clearly a need for such study of, that extended to multiple countries or even in an international way. So there is a group, a research consortium called ODSI, so Observational Health Data Science and Informatics. So this is an international consortium of study groups where the participants, they voluntarily can map whatever EHR system they have to a standard vocabulary shown on the right figure, which is called the OMOP, Common Data Model. And after you map that, they can do some unified analysis across all the different participants in the ODSI network. And they have also do a lot of COVID-related studies, and this work is also some risk calculator. The ODSI study group developed, and the method is called SeqCover. So they were the goal is to develop COVID-19 estimated risk, which they call the cover scores, to quantify a patient's risk of hospital admission. They call cover H, requiring intensive services. They call cover I, or fatality. They call cover F, due to the COVID-19 using the ODSI database. And actually, the SeqCover model was developed using the Optum data, and they identified more than 7 million valid visits with influenza or flu-like symptoms, of which over 4 million were patients aged 18 or older, and around 3 million had more than 1 year observation prior to the visit, and over 2 million of these had no prior influenza symptoms, pneumonia, in the 6 days prior to the index date. And they selected a stratified sample, including 150,000 patients from the total population, to effectively develop the model to predict the risk. And they have included like the predictors described here, like including age in the group, sex, and binary variables indicating the presence and absence of the recorded conditions in drug in any time prior to the index. And in total, they obtained about 32,000 candidate predictors indicating the presence of those unique conditions in drug recorded prior to the index date. And 75% of patients used to develop the prediction model, and remaining 25% was used for validation. And they train a model using LaSu with a threefold cross-validation to tune the parameters. So they also generated this figure, which shows the model for predicting the cover H, which is a hospitalization risk, cover I, which is the intensive services, and the cover F, which is a death. This figure also presents the risk converter, which allows for easy conversion between the risk score and the predicted risk of different outcomes. And they provide a plot of probability distribution of the three models of patients to demonstrate the expected regions of the plot of the probability fall into. To calculate the cover scores, the clinician needs to identify which predictors the patient has, and the points for each of those predictors are then added and arrive total score, which is pretty easy to use. So this is one work. So far we have talked a lot about the diagnostics and prognostics, which are mainly in the classification or prediction setups for COVID-19. But another important characteristic that complements people's understanding or research to this disease is it is highly heterogeneous. It may cause a lot of different phenotypical symptoms. And so there is actually a concept called deep phenotyping, which is really, we are trying to discover homogeneous phenotypes or patient populations from the entire patient population, such that for each disease phenotype, which is usually called a deep phenotype or subphenotype, they may have, number one, they have similar phenotypical manifestations, and number two, so they have some common characteristics which may suggest that they may have some common disease mechanism behind. So with the identification of the phenotypes, we hope the subphenotypes or the deep phenotypes, we hope to understand better the disease so that we can develop targeted treatment or management plans for patients with distinct clinical or phenotypical characteristics. So this is another study done by the ATSI folks, where they have investigated a total of 34,000 individuals hospitalized with COVID-19 in the ATSI network. And this is a table showing the summary statistics of those patients across different institutions. So here, CUIMC stands for Columbia University Irving Medical Center. HIRA stands for Health Insurance Review and Assessment. HM stands for HM Hospitals. PHD stands for Premier Healthcare Database. SIDAIP stands for the Information System for Research in Primary Care. UCHDC stands for University of Colorado Health Data Compass. VAOMAP stands for the Department of Veterans Affairs. And this table shows the distribution of comorbidities in COVID-19 patients across different sites and countries. And it shows that the mean Chausen comorbidity index of those hospitalized COVID-19 patients in the US range from 3.1 for PHD to 5.4 for VAOMAP, from 0.8 to HM to 1.4 for SIDIAP in span, and was 2.7 in HIRA, covering South Korea. And in the US, the proportion of these hospitalized COVID-19 patients who had asthma ranged from 7 to 15%, and from 24 to 43% for diabetes, from 28 to 49% for heart disease, and from 8 to 18% for cancer. In Spain, it was between 4 to 7% for asthma, from 13 to 22% for diabetes, from 17 to 27% for heart disease, and from 5 to 16% for cancer. In South Korea, 12% of those had a history of asthma, 17% has diabetes, and 13% of heart disease, and 4% for cancer. So we can see the distribution of South Korea is very different in terms of the comorbidities compared to US and Spain. And the prevalence of hypertension ranged from 37 to 70% in US, from 30 to 46% in Spain, and 24% in South Korea. And this figure shows the prevalence of conditions and medication use among COVID-19 patients. And if individuals hospitalized with COVID-19 between December 2019 and April 2020 are included in the study, and conditions from up to a year prior, medication used from day of hospitalization. Each dot represents one of these covariates, and the color indicating the type of condition or medication. So you can see a more holistic view on the condition and medication use. And another investigation the authors have done is actually they compared the difference of hospitalized COVID-19 patients and seasonal influenza. And they compared the age difference, which is shown in this way. Individual hospitalized with COVID-19 were compared with the patient who hospitalized with influenza between September 2014 to April 2019, wherever available, and proportion of cohorts by 5-year age groups with counts of less than 10 are omitted. And so from which you can see that there is some distribution discrepancy between the patients who are hospitalized because of COVID-19 and influenza. But this work is just some epidemiological characterizations of the COVID-19 patients who are hospitalized. I mean, it definitely gives us an overview internationally about certain characteristics, mostly in terms of the disease comorbidities and medication use. And also they studied the difference of those patients comparing to seasonal influenza. But another thing, as we explained in the deep phenotyping concept, we also want to identify the homogeneous subgroups among the COVID-19 patients to understand if there is any homogeneous groups which may represent different disease mechanism. So we have done some study based on the INSIGHT data, which is kind of like a clinical research network across the New York City. And in this data, they have a COVID data lake. And it includes 5 different institutions, including NYU, New York University, New York Presbyterian Hospital, Weill Cornell Medical Center, Mount Sinai Hospital, Montefiore, and also New York Presbyterian Hospital, Columbia Medical Center. So we basically think of the subphenotyping problem as a clustering process where we basically take the lab test profiles of the patients at the admission date, which is the date when they confirmed with RT-PCR test, confirmed with COVID-19 according to the test or a diagnosis code. And then we build a lab test profile, which is a vector with every dimension corresponding to a specific lab test. And then we do clustering on top of that to identify the clusters. And we use NYU, NYP, WCMC, Mount Sinai, Montefiore as the development cohort, and we further split 70% as the development and the other 30% as internal validation cohort, and we use Columbia Medical Center as an external validation cohort for this subphenotype development or discovery process. And this is an entire pipeline. So we also performed some sensitivity analysis by removing outliers or change to different methods, and we have tested like hierarchical agglomerative clustering and Gaussian mixture model, and we tested them, we validated them on both the internal validation and external validation cohorts, and we also build a predictor, based on the data from the development cohort, and use that predictor to predict the cluster membership in the validation cohorts. And we got and see the predictive power of such a predictor. And the predictor, the input variables of the predictors are essentially those lab test values. And this is actually the characteristics of the cohorts we have included in our study. So we have, as we said, so we have a development cohort including about 8,200 patients. We have an internal validation cohort includes about 3,500 patients, and the external validation cohort including 2,700 patients, and these are the distributions of those three cohorts, including demographics, the outcomes. And after the clustering, we detected four different subgroups, and we have done some statistical analysis to characterize the four subphenotypes. So this is a kind of like, we examine if there is any abnormal routine lab tests associated with the different subphenotypes. Like here, we can clearly see subphenotype 1 is the subphenotype with the most mild conditions, because they have very few abnormal lab tests associated, and subphenotype 4 is the most severe one. And for subphenotype 2 and 3, they are kind of like the moderate ones associated, between, with their severity between subphenotype 1 and 4. And we can see for subphenotype 2, they have a higher portion of lab abnormalities, especially on the inflammation, but for inflammation-related markers. But for subphenotype 3, we don't really see that. And this is a characterization of those four subphenotypes according to the comorbidities. Still, we can see subphenotype 1, the patients are associated with the least number of, least a portion of comorbidities. In subphenotype 4, they are associated with the most portion of comorbidities. In subphenotype 2 and 3, they are kinds of similar, but subphenotype 3, they have more comorbidity burdens compared to subphenotype 2, while subphenotype 2, they have more severe inflammation marker values, abnormal values. And this is a kind of like the associated outcome of those four different subphenotypes on the development cohort, the internal validation cohort, and the external validation cohort, from which we can, this is a Kaplan-Meier type of survival probability curve. So as we characterize according to the previous two slides, so this validates the subphenotype 1. They are with the least severe condition, and subphenotype 2, they are with the most severe condition, while 2 and 3, they are pretty close. So for we also examined how the composition of different subphenotypes at different time slices from week 1, which is from early March, until week 14. So we can see over the time on the development cohort and validation cohort, it's pretty much a subphenotype 4 appears mostly at the peak time, which is March and April in New York, while subphenotype 1 over the time, I mean, there are some fluctuations. They have a higher proportion at the beginning, at the end. Excuse me. With the rest of the portions occupied by subphenotype 2 and 3. So this, if you remember my introduction about our first work with respect to build predictive models of SARS-CoV-2 infection status based on routine blood test, if you remember that CT value plot. So this aligns with that CT value plot very well, because we, if you remember, we did see the CT value of the SARS-CoV-2 positive patients. So they are higher in the peak time, and later on they become lower. And so these are like the two deep phenotyping work, one by Odyssey, which is mostly epidemiological characterization, and one from us based on the New York multi-institutional data. But both of them focusing on a static setting where like the patient are represented as vectors, and we just look at their characteristics at the admission or the confirmation. But actually COVID-19 is a progressive disease. So this is a conceptual model on how COVID-19 progresses over time. So you have like a viral response phase and host inflammation response phase. And across the entire phase, you may have different symptoms and also different biomarker values, and a different treatment may work at different stages. So if we just look at the characteristics at a single time point, we cannot have a holistic recognition of such disease. So, I mean, based on that, so we have also done some research on the progression of COVID-19, especially in the critical care setting. And the first work we do is comparing the albumin level over time for critically ill COVID-19 patients versus sepsis patient. And this is a cohort characterized summary statistics for both cohorts. So we did a retrospective study at New York Presbyterian Hospital, Weill Cornell Medicine, compared, as I said, two critically ill cohorts with COVID-19 and sepsis. And adult patients in the COVID-19 cohort were admitted from March 3rd, 2020 to July 10, 2020. SARS-CoV-2 diagnosis was made through the RT-PCR test performed on nasal swabs, and adult patients with sepsis defined according to the sepsis 3 criteria were admitted from December 12, 2006 to February 26, 2019. And the method we use as demonstrated at this. So we evaluated the serum albumin levels. We particularly looking at the albumin levels from 7 days prior to 30 days after intubation for each cohort. So we averaged the albumin levels over 24 hours if more than one value was available. So we chunk the time access into the resolution of per day. We then examined the albumin progression trajectories aligned at the intubation time in survivors and non-survivors. We hypothesized that albumin recovery would be apparent in COVID-19 survivors. We derived an algorithm shown in this paper. So clearly there will be an albumin deterioration trend at the beginning after the intubation, and for the survivors, they're gonna become recovering. So the albumin level gonna increase. So we can think of it as a two-stage process. And we derived an algorithm based on the CHOS test to detect the albumin trajectory breakpoints, which is a transition point between the deterioration trend and recovering trend for each patient. Specifically for every patient, the CHOS test was performed for each time point of the albumin trajectory, and the breakpoint was determined by rejection with p-value smaller than 0.05 and f-value bigger than 3 of null hypothesis that the coefficients of linear regressions before and after the breakpoint are equal. After that, we fit linear mixed effect model to estimate the deteriorating and recovering trajectories for survivors and non-survivors, respectively. And we adjusted for age and sex. So albumin, this figure shows the albumin trajectory in all critically ill COVID-19 patients. So we can see they cleared two distinct phases. So phase 1, which is a deterioration, was defined as a rapid albumin loss, and phase 2, which is a recovery phase, showed albumin stabilization or improvement. The CHOS test albumin breakpoint for each patient occurred about 5.5 days after intubation versus 5.6 days after intubation in survivors and non-survivors, while the breakpoints of albumin level was lower for non-survivors compared to that in the survivors. So based on the breakpoint of each patient, linear mixed effect model identified clear deterioration phases with similar slopes among the non-survivors. So following the deterioration phase, there is a recovery phase for survivors that are much higher than the non-survivors. So that aligns with our hypothesis. But for a sepsis patient, so as we can see, there's no clear two-phase type of trend. So this is also aligns with what we have hypothesized. So similar to the Odyssey subphenotyping study, this is also kind of like a phenotyping study comparing specifically the temporal trend of the albumin level for critically ill COVID patients versus sepsis patients who are on mechanical ventilation or intubation. But we are also interested in identifying the progression subphenotypes such that the patients within the same subphenotype, they share similar progression trajectories. So this may tell us the insights on what are the patterns that and how those patients gonna progress over time, which is crucial for the clinicians to understand status of the patients and make appropriate decisions. And in order to characterize the characteristics of the patients, we use something called a sequential organ failure assessment scores. So it is a score characterizing the organ failure status of the patient. I mean, a lot of the times it's in the critical care setting. And it includes 6 different subphenotypes. I mean, 6 subscores characterizing the status of 6 organ systems, including the central neural system, the respiration, the coagulation, the cardiovascular, the liver, and the renal. And for every subscore, it has a scale between 0 to 4, and the total score is just adding up all of them together. So it's between 0 to 24. And we have investigated the trajectory subphenotyping using the cohort of the patients in NYP Weill Cornell from March 1st to May 12th, and we validated the discovered subphenotypes using another independent hospital from NYP, Lower Manhattan. And the SOFA scores were similarly as we did in albumin level. So we aggregated the SOFA score for each day. So for patients who miss 3 days SOFA score were excluded, and we just investigate the patients who, number one, are intubated, number two, 7 days, they have 7 days after intubation, 7 days of records after intubation, and we dual trajectory clustering on the 7-day window. And so the COVID, as we said, so the COVID patients, progression is highly complex. So in order to deal with such complexity, so we first stratify the patients according to their baseline conditions, because for patients when they are so when they started intubation, they could be in very different stage, and this stage may lead to different progression patterns. So we first stratify those patients at the time of their intubation according to their baseline SOFA score, and we stratify them as mild, intermediate, and severe. And from the composition of the SOFA score, we find that for the mild stratum, those patients are with respiration and central neural system dysfunctions, and for intermediate, they further have cardiovascular dysfunctions, and for severe, they further have renal dysfunctions. And then we perform trajectory clustering for every stratum, and in this case, we particularly are interested in discovering the increasing trend and decreasing trend. And these are the identified subphenotypes over the 3 stratum for the increasing trend, which suggests the worsening subphenotype, and the decreasing trend, which suggests the recovering trend. And so we can see the 2 trend for all 3 strata. And this is the result on the validation set, which we can see pretty much the same trend, but for the mild stratum, we can see, the curves are not that smooth. This is because the number of samples is really small. It's just 10. And we also calculated the cumulated outcome association over the time for the different stratum, and from which we can clearly see for worsening subphenotypes across all the baseline strata suffered from a significantly higher risk of mortality within the 30-day window after intubation, while recovering subphenotypes across all baseline strata showed significantly higher extubation rate compared to worsening subphenotypes. And this is a validation, the results on the validation cohort, we can pretty much observe the similar patterns. And we also examined if we can leverage the characteristics captured early on during the intubation to predict the progression subphenotype assignment, because if we can we can do that, then it can help us predict these progression patterns at early stage. So it gives more time for the clinicians to make appropriate decisions. And we, investigated the association between the biomarkers, including 27 lab tests, and for vital signs. We first examined their associations between the subphenotype or the cluster assignment across all the baseline, all the strata and subphenotypes. And this shows on the mild strata, like the difference between the CRP, the neutrophil, and WBC. the distribution of them over 7 days for the recovering and worsening subphenotype. So we can see that these markers were significantly higher within the first 7 days after intubation compared to, for the worsening group comparing to the recovering group. This may suggest that the inflammatory mechanism prevents the worsening subphenotype from recovery within the mild stratum. And this is the same similar analysis on the severe stratum. So we can see, the biomarkers we investigated here includes ferritin, bilirubin, platelets, and creatinine. So we can see, we can observe significantly higher ferritin, continuously increasing bilirubin and creatinine, as well as a significantly lower platelet value were observed within the worsening subphenotype compared to the recovering one. And this suggested that within the severe stratum, the worsening subphenotype was probably driven by cell death, macrophage activation, and over organ dysfunction with intravascular coagulation. And as we said, we want to build predictive models from the clinical characteristics of the patient at early stage to later on, and this shows the prediction performance. And we can see that the predictive model here is based on the random forest classifier. We can see if we use more and more information from day 1 to day 5, the classification performance is going to increase. And the algorithm can achieve the best performance on the severe stratum, and they suffer the most on the intermediate stratum. And we also shows the differential contributions of different predictors from SOFA subscores to lab tests to vital signs and respiratory variables in the contribution. And this is just based on the feature importance score produced in the scikit-learn package with respect to random forest. So we can see from day 1 to day 5 across different stages, different strata, the contribution of those factors are different. So with all that, that's pretty much everything I want to introduce about how AI type of algorithms can be helpful with the clinical research of battling with COVID-19. Of course, this cannot be complete, but I just hope the audience can have a sense on what problems that the clinicians are interested in and how those technologies can help. So the next part will be the social and the behavioral research. Thank you. So now let's go to the 5th part of this tutorial, which is about behavioral and social science studies. So although personally I don't do any related study for COVID-19, but I still think this is an important area that we should mention in this tutorial. So this is an infographic showing a selection of topics from social and behavioral research relevant that during a pandemic, and topics covered in this figure include threat perception, social context, science communication, individual and collective interests, leadership, and stress and coping. And this figure is from this Nature Human Behavior journal, and we're gonna touch some of the topics in this part. In this figure, and this is a study published on PNAS. Where the author is trying to study the change of information searching behavior for before and after the announcement of the first case in the U.S. And it is from the figure. I mean, the vertical bar is the time when the first case was announced, and from the model that is shown, I mean here. So where the TIK is an indicator variable, TIK is an indicator variable set to 1. If the first case of the state I was announced K days ago, and the reference category was 1 day prior to the first case announcement, and the authors created a single indicator announcement TI31 for any K larger than 30, and an announcement TI minus 41 for any K smaller than minus 40, and they controlled for fixed effects to allow time invariant differences in search patterns by the state, and for date fixed effects to account for national trends. And the standard error allows for the heterogeneity and clustering at state level, and the Poisson coefficient confidence intervals are shown here for the 40-day leading up to the first case announcement and up to the 24 days following that. And the vertical axis measures the differential percentage change in search frequency as the states approach the first case announcement. And the figure shows that the search for coronavirus increased by 36% on the day immediately after the announcement, but quickly decreased back to the baseline level in less than a week ago. And these figures also from that study showing the time varying effect of announcement of the first COVID-19 case in the state on search for, the symptoms and treatment, the hand sanitizer and the diagnostic tests, the coordinated responses such as quarantine, the narratives that undermine public responses, such as the coronavirus conspiracy, and point estimated coefficients are dotted lines, and the gray band shows 95% confidence interval in the Poisson models. Different and average search frequency per state per day for the terms including like coronavirus symptom, it is about 8,500, and hand sanitizer, it is 3,200, and a quarantine, it is about 2,200, and for coronavirus conspiracy, it's 200. So this study basically shows the information searching behavior change with the announcement of the first COVID-19 case. So people are interested in, immediately showed interest on as reflected on their searching behavior. And another related thing is about misinformation propagated by the media, as well as the regular media, as well as the social media during the pandemic. And this study, actually, it is a wide working paper from the University of Chicago, and the study examined two most popular cable news show in the United States, the Hannity and Tucker Carlson Tonight, and the shows are aired back to back on the same network, which is Fox News, and had relatively similar content prior to January 2020. And they separated sharply in their coverage of the COVID-19 and pandemic. And so for the difference of the two TV shows, so Hannity first ignored the topics on his show, and COVID-related topic on his show, and then dismissed the risks associated of the virus. And Carlson warned viewers that the coronavirus might pose a serious threat from early February. And actually, Hannity began to moderate his tone in early March, and that the two shows had largely converged in their coverage of the coronavirus by mid-March. And this is a figure showing the counts of coronavirus related terms, including coronavirus, COVID, virus, influenza, and flu separately for Hannity and Tucker Carlson tonight. And the other Fox News shows aired on Fox News between 5 p.m. and 11 p.m. local time across all four major time zones in the continental U.S. and those media includes the 5 special reports with Brett Baer and the story with Martha McCullum, Fox News at Night, and the Ingraham and Angeli. Compared to the other, the Ingraham Angel, compared to the other 3 primetime shows, both Hannity and Tucker Carlson tonight stand out, and they both anchored first discussed the coronavirus in the late January when the first U.S. case was reported, but Carlson continued to discuss subject extensively throughout February, whereas Hannity did not again mention it on his show until, as reflected here, until the end of the month. The other 3 shows fell somewhere between these two extremes. By early March, the word count shows had converged. And this figure displays density function viewers reported day of behavior change in response. The authors of the study have conducted a survey. So, this figure displays density function viewers reported day of behavioral change in response to the coronavirus. For respondents who report that they have not changed any of their behavior by the dates of the survey, they impute the date of the survey. The dashed line indicates the mean date of the behavior change among the viewers of each show. And the figure shows the viewers of Hannity changed their behavior 4 or 5 days later than the viewers of other shows, while the viewers of Tucker Carlson tonight changed their behavior 3 to 4 days earlier than the viewers of our shows. And the difference in coefficients is also significantly statistically significant. So this is very interesting by examining the behavioral change through show viewership analysis. And in addition to that, there are also researchers that are trying to collect the misinformation on social media and to build a public database for researchers to study further. And this is a data set called Recovery, which is constructed by a group of researchers from Syracuse University. And they use a Twitter premium search API to track the spread of the collected news articles on Twitter. They also track for those unreliable and reliable news articles who retweeted them and how they got propagated. And this table are some summary statistics of the news articles included in this data set. And this is the general statistics of the data set across different publishers, and the authors have showed according to the labels of the news articles. They also characterize the publishers as reliable or unreliable, and this is a histogram of both type of publishers and the number of news articles they published. And similarly, the same group of authors have constructed a misinformation news article data set for Chinese news. And this is kind of like the summary statistics of that data set. And another important aspect we need to consider is the psychological effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the goal here is like, for this study, which is from a group from Georgia Tech, is to provide insights regarding people's psychosocial concerns during COVID-19 pandemic by leveraging social media data. I think in this case is mostly the Twitter, and they want to study the temporal and linguistic change in symptomatic mental health and support expressions in the pandemic context. And they have both treatment and control data, and the treatment data is with geo-bounded coordinates, 1% real-time Twitter data originated from the United States, and they collected over 60 million Twitter posts between March 24, 2020 and May 24, 2020. And control data is from nearly 41 million Twitter posts shared between March 24, 2019 and May 24, 2019. So it's almost a year's gap. And here I showed, which is copied from the paper, some of the example posts of high symptomatic mental health expressions. As you can see, like, I'm so sick and tired of the coronavirus, and this kind of person I am, I don't deserve to meet these people, and so on and so forth. And this figure shows, as a comparison, shows the change in symptomatic mental health expressions for the same period within the treatment and control group. If you remember, so the treatment is 2020 and control is 2019. And authors find that the treatment and control data sets showed significant difference in people's symptomatic expressions, among which anxiety shows the most significant increase, followed by suicidal ideation, depression, and stress. And the authors also examined the change of the support expressions, and these are some of the example posts with the support expressions I copied from their paper. And this is a change curve, which shows the evolution of support expressions change in the treatment and control data sets. Again, the difference is significant. And the authors, and you can see the emotional support increased by about 5%, and the informational support increased by about 5% as well. Another important aspect is about human mobility. Because of the various non-pharmaceutical intervention policies, a lot of people's mobility pattern and behavior got completely changed. And this is actually from a study published by on Nature. And the authors leveraged the mobility network, which captures hourly visits from each census block group to each point of interest. And in this, within these two figures, it is an example of 2 days, March and April in Chicago. And the vertical lines indicate the most visits between nearby POIs and CBGs. And we can see visits dropped markedly from March to April, as indicated by the lower density of gray lines. And mobility networks in Chicago from the metro area, are shown for 1 p.m. on 2 Mondays, March 2nd, 2020, and April 6, 2020. And the authors also tried to make use of the mobility network to predict the trend of the epidemic in terms of the number of cases using an SER model, and they overlay the SER model on those mobility networks. And the authors assume that any suspectable visitors to POI PJ at time t has the same independent probability lambda t of being infected and transitioning from suspectable to exposed state. And there are Wij visitors from CBGC to POIP at time t, and they assume that ST over N, fraction of them are suspectable, and number of new exposures among those visitors is distributed as a Poisson distribution shown here. And number of new exposures among all outgoing visitors from CBGC I is therefore distributed at the sum of the all the expression of over all the POIs. So that's basically how they leverage the mobility network in the SEIR model. And the authors fitted separate models to 10 of the largest US metro areas, and they modeled a total population of 98 million people. And in all those, I mean, this figure shows 9 out of 10 metro areas. And the blue line represents the model predictions, and the gray crosses represent the number of daily reported cases. As the number of reported cases tend to have great variability, they also show the smoothed weekly average, which is the orange line, and the shaded regions denotes the 2.5 and 97.5 percentiles across the parameter sets and stochastic realization. So we can see their model can perform pretty well by leveraging the mobility network. And this is taking Chicago as an example. I mean, the authors examined the effect of modifying the magnitude and timing of mobility pattern change. So we can see, I mean, the counterfactual simulations of past reductions in mobility illustrate the magnitude of the reduction in the middle was at least important as its timing, which is shown on the right. So both magnitude and timing are important. They also examined the effect of different reopening strategies for the pandemic, based on the mobility network. And the figure shows the cumulative number of predictive infections after 1 month of reopening is plotted against the fraction of visits lost by partial instead of full reopening. And the annotations within the plot shows a fraction of maximum occupancy that is used as a cap, and the horizontal red line indicates the cumulative number of predicted infections at the point of reopening, which is on May the 1st, 2020. So compared to full reopening capping at 20% of the maximum capacity in Chicago, reduces the number of new infections by more than 80%, while losing only 42% overall. So reopening full service restaurant has the largest, from the right figure, you can see, has the largest predicted impact on the infections due to the large number of restaurants, as well as their high visit densities and long dwell times. So this is a very interesting study, showing the value of leveraging the human mobility network to predict the pandemic trend, as well as estimate the impact of different reopening strategies. And the last thing I want to mention is the contact tracing software, which is pretty important for controlling the pandemic as well. And this paper published on IEEE Access summarized the existing apps for contact tracing, and they kind of categorize them into 3 architectures: so centralized, decentralized, and hybrid. So for This figure shows the main entities and interactions of the centralized architecture. And they explain this based on the Blue Trace protocol. The initial requirement for the app is that the user has to pre-register with the central server, and the server generates a privacy-preserving temporary ID for each device, and this temporary ID is then encrypted with a secret key, which is known only to the central server authority and sent to the device. Device exchange these temporary IDs in terms of Bluetooth encounter messages when they come in close contact with each other. So once the user tests positive, they can volunteer to upload all their stored encounter messages to the central server. The server maps the temporary IDs in these messages to individuals to identify at-risk contacts. And this is the decentralized structure. So in contrast to the centralized architecture. So this architecture proposed to move the core functionalities to user devices, leaving the server with minimal involvement in the contact tracing process, mainly for security reasons. The idea is to enhance user privacy by generating anonymous identifiers at the user devices and processing the exposure notifications on individual devices instead of the centralized server. So this figure is based on the private automated contact tracing protocol. So it does not require app users to pre-register before use, thus avoid the storage of the protected health information or personal protected information on the server. Devices generate their random seeds, which is used as input for a pseudo-random function, which are used in combination with the current time to generate privacy-preserving pseudonyms or chirps with a very short lifetime of about 1 minute. These chirps are subsequently periodically exchanged with other devices that come in close contact. Once a user is positively diagnosed with COVID-19, they can volunteer to upload their seeds and relevant time information to a central server. This is in contrast to the centralized architecture, where the complete list of encounter messages needs to be uploaded. And uploading the seeds instead of all used chirps improves the latency and provides improved bandwidth utilization. And finally is the hybrid architecture. So in the centralized architecture, the server performs all the complex tasks, such as temporary ID calculations, encryptions, decryptions, risk analysis, and notification of alerts for at-risk contacts. On the other hand, all these functionalities are delegated to devices in the decentralized architecture, keeping the server only as a bulletin board for lookup purpose. The hybrid architecture proposes that these functionalities are split between the server and the devices. More specifically, the temporary ID generation and management remain decentralized, which means that it is handled by the devices to ensure privacy and anonymization, while the risk analysis and notifications should be the responsibility of the centralized server. So there are three main reasons for performing tracing process at the server. Number one, in the decentralized architecture, the server is unaware of the number of at-risk users as the devices make this risk analysis without taking the server into consideration. Thus, the server does not have any statistical information and is unable to run any data analytics to identify exposure clusters. Number two, risk analysis and notifications are considered a sensitive process that should be handled by the authorities, keeping the existing infrastructure resources and state of the pandemic in mind. And three, the uploaded encounter information from infected users is not made available to other users but remain only at the server. So this is to avoid the user de-anonymization attacks possible in the decentralized architecture. So with all that, I want to conclude this part. So we have introduced several interesting studies as well as a survey about contact tracing apps, about social and behavioral studies and research, and these are important components for fighting with the pandemic as well. And now let's go to the final part, which is this discussion and conclusion and some of the future directions. So now let's come to the last portion of this tutorial, which is about conclusions and future directions. So let's look at this virus again. So it brings to us a lot of troubles, and we have introduced all kinds of efforts, especially related to AI, where AI can be helpful for fighting with this virus, including the epidemiology, where the goal is mainly to, we have talked about how to use those epidemiological ordinary differential equation models to predict the trend of the pandemic, such as the number of new cases and the number of deaths, and how can we, because of the complexity of COVID-19, like the incubation period and delayed reporting, and all kinds of different non-pharmaceutical interventions. So how can we incorporate those factors into the conventional epidemiological models, and how can we leverage machine learning to learn the model parameters more efficiently and effectively, and how to evaluate the impact of different non-pharmaceutical interventions, and how can we leverage the experience of different regions that are at different period of the pandemic. And we have also, and in the second part, we introduced the therapeutics. So how to leverage multi-omics data and networks, and as well as basic science data to design the molecules, and how to improve the efficiency. How can we identify potentially repurposable drug targets that are already on market with different therapeutic indications. And we talk about clinical studies, about diagnostics and prognostics based on long CT scans and routine blood tests, and how can we perform disease subphenotyping according to the patient characteristics at admission, as well as longitudinal progression, and how can we more precisely stratify the patient, understanding the disease mechanism, as well as the social and behavioral research, including how can we, what the pandemic has changed people's behavior on the internet and on social media, and how can we assess the psychosocial impact of the pandemic on patients based on their expressions on social media, as well as how can we leverage people's mobility patterns to do the deep pandemic prediction, as well as how can we develop appropriate contact tracing apps to track the pandemic, the trend of the pandemic. And so then the question is, how can we effectively fight for the disease and stop the pandemic. So the question is, we really need to integrate all different aspects, because none of them could be negligible. And and clearly the solution is collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. So we need the expertise from experts like computer scientists, basic scientists, clinicians, engineers, and so on and so forth. We really need to join the force of people from all different aspects to effectively fight for the pandemic. I think that's really the lessons we learned from the battling with COVID-19. And from the AI perspective, so I think in order to join the efforts with experts from other domains, we need to have two things. So number one is the data. Number two is the algorithm. So with the big comment on collaboration. So recently, this notion of open data science have been emphasized more and more. So for people working on different aspects, fighting with the pandemic, we really need to share the experience and share the data to make sure about the insights we generated are not biased and not due to a model misspecification or because of the potential bias and so on and so forth. So sharing the data, sharing the insights, sharing the model implementations are really important when facing with a pandemic like COVID-19. And some examples, so this is a COVID data index built by researchers at University of Texas Health Center at Houston, where they basically track the public COVID-19 related data sets and appropriately index them and create this COVID-19 data index, which is really a good resource for people to look for whatever data sets that are related to COVID-19. And there are also several national or international consortium established or established before, like Odyssey. There are a specific task force on COVID-19 within Odyssey. And there's also the National COVID Cohort Collaborative funded through NIH, and also the 4CE Consortium for the clinical characterization of COVID-19 by EHR. And there's also this PREPARE effort, which stands for Pandemic Research for Preparedness and Resilience. And it is a virtual organization funded by NSF to foster increased discussion and collaboration among SIs, which is a directory under NSF, researchers focusing on computing and information science and engineering. And we have, and the PREPARE team has already had the kickoff workshop at the end of last year. And I am fortunate to be one of their co-organizers as well. And we have released a summary report from the workshop summarizing the discussions of the people that have attended the workshop according to their expertise areas, including computational biology and bioinformatics, epidemiology and public health, education, training, and workforce development, computing and data infrastructure, privacy and security, socioeconomics and psychological impact, surveillance, contact tracing and testing, infodemiology, and social networks. So this report is freely available on the PREPARE website. You feel free to download it if you're interested. And on the model side, so there are several directions that are informed by the battle with COVID on the model development side. One is this integrative analysis. So how can we, because I mean, the data related to COVID-19 is so heterogeneous, from a really microscopic, like single cell and gene data, to really macroscopic, like environmental data. So how can we design approaches to integrate the analysis on the data sets covering all different aspects is really a challenge, and it's going to be continue to be promising direction for us when facing with the pandemic. Or battling with other diseases as well. And second is model interpretation. So we really want to develop models to be interpretable, explainable, such that the domain experts from all different aspects, they can understand how the model works, instead of just giving them like a black box. And I wrote this piece in Annals of Internal Medicine last year, and there are pretty much two types of model interpretability: intrinsic or post hoc. But there are still lots of problems, like intrinsic interpretability. The model typically has a simple structure, or for complex structure like deep learning, it can inject attention mechanism. But recent studies have found attention mechanisms, they usually play the role like a combinatorial shortcut, directly serve as features to boost the prediction performance, instead of really can tell you which features are important or which features are not. And for post hoc interpretability, so some studies have found that with the same model, you can derive different interpretations. So how can we handle such interpretation instability, and so on and so forth? So there are still a long way to go to really make the model interpretation reliable and generalizable and usable. And another thing is model security. So we have seen this about the adversarial attack for images, and which may cause a big threat to autonomous driving system if you do adversarial attack on traffic signs, let's say. But for biomedical data, there's a science paper also talk about that. So we can deliberately change the patient's records to, like in this case, to make a medical fraud, and let the algorithm pass through the fraud check. With more and more of these machine learning models got deployed and applied in the biomedical workflows, it is more and more becoming more and more important to guarantee the security of those models and make those models really robust with respect to all those different kinds of attacks. And the third thing we haven't really talked about in this tutorial, but it is an important topic on studying the disparity of patients, like how they receive the care, and what about the clinical outcome disparity among patients within different ethnicity groups, racial and ethnicity groups. And this is actually a science paper talking about using an algorithm to determine, a widely used algorithm to determine whether a patient is eligible for a specific healthcare management program. And the study found that in order to be eligible for the program, the Black patient needs to be much more sick compared to the white patient in terms of accumulated chronic conditions. This is because some of the features used in the model can really cause such bias. And with the pandemic, it becomes even more crucial to deliver a fair healthcare, and so it is really important to be aware of this potential bias that could be brought in by the data or by the model, and take appropriate actions in, to basically when you design the model, or when you realize that, how you're going to adjust the model in a post hoc way. Like this is a paper we wrote recently about how to adjust the rank of the predicted risks to make sure the prediction result is fair across different racial groups. and also federated learning. So it's also related to the privacy issues because the data are scattered here and there, and a lot of the biomedical data, especially clinical data, contain sensitive protected patient health information. So how can we leverage as much information as possible across those different institutions, while at the same time without releasing the patient privacy information. So federated learning provides a good candidate solution to this problem, and we can envision the promises of federated learning when facing with the pandemic, especially. And with all that, I hope everybody has a relatively a holistic overview about the research on where AI could be applied and help with the battling with the COVID-19 pandemic. And as I said, of course, the tutorial cannot be complete, but I try to touch the important studies as much as possible. And one unfortunate thing is we cannot have this meeting in person because of the pandemic. So clearly this online presentation gonna sacrifice the quality and experience a lot. So if you have any questions or requests or ideas for collaborations, so please feel free to reach out to me, and I will be more than happy to collaborate with you guys. And so with all that, I want to acknowledge my team members and also all my collaborators, and of course, the funding agencies that supports my research, especially related to COVID-19 related research. And with all that, I want to show here about, again, my contact information, including my email, my Twitter, my homepage, and also the tutorial website. So in case there is any update on the contents of the tutorial, it will appear on this website. So please pay attention. And thank you very much for everyone for listening to my tutorial. And I firmly believe that AI will be the future, will play a critical role in the future battling, battling with any future pandemic. Thank you.